Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of our time with COVID-19. We are going to be exploring this afternoon the impact that it is having on business-to-business marketing. And so we'll start by looking at some of the overall macro trends and how those are impacting businesses. And we'll dive down all the way through the impact that COVID is having on small businesses and how they are looking to sort of combat, obviously, the crisis with which we find ourselves in. Overall, as we look at the COVID pandemic, we see it really as a trend accelerator, where a lot of what is happening is really ultimately pushing traditional businesses into the digital age. We see things like test drives being scheduled now at home. A lot of individuals and businesses are certainly becoming more reliant on delivery services. We see 26% of US households now ordering online grocery service for the first time. And I think what will be interesting is that once the consumers get used to these various services that are now available to them digitally, how these industries will oftentimes find it difficult to go back to traditional operations on the other side of the pandemic. Another trend that we see percolating in the background is the at-home economy. We certainly see a rise of a lot of expertise-driven influencers, many of whom are actually service-based workers and are now kind of tapping into their talents and expertise to continue to find ways to showcase and monetize their skills while also promoting products. You think about platforms like Masterclass and a number of others that are giving individuals chances to hone and learn a lot of new skill sets as well. One of the other big things that we're seeing is a lot of disruption in media, as we all certainly experience on a day-to-day basis. Event cancellations have caused a lot of major disruption to media productions and scheduling. And we're seeing a lot of media companies quickly moving their content over to more digital formats and online delivery as they obviously struggle to sort of keep up with the change in consumer behavior. And one of the things that we know, even coming out of Magna, is obviously things like streaming continue to increase quite significantly. At this point, they've nearly doubled since last year's level, seeing about a 77% increase from year over year. With that large portion of that viewing happening during prime time. Despite the $2 trillion coronavirus stimulus package that the US government has passed, it does seem inevitable, though, that we are going to face an economic downturn with a potentially long recovery period. We're obviously seeing a lot of Americans and individuals reporting, job losses. Or work-related income as a result of this pandemic, and so that's starting to have obviously a significant impact on the economy. And I think that it's only going to sort of increase the longer that obviously these businesses are closed. And one of the things that we find really interesting is this focus that consumers are having on corporate responsibility and what your company does and what your brand does during this global crisis will be remembered by consumers for a long time. There's a site that was created called Did They Help, which was actually built to score how brands have responded to the C-19 pandemic. And they score brands against a number of different criteria like response time, store closures, are they making any kinds of donations, what are they doing to help out their local communities or their employee base. And I think what's really important about this is that this is ultimately becomes a building block for future relationships and customer loyalty. We know, as we've seen from a survey by Edelman, that nearly 2/3 of consumers believe that a brand's response in regards to this crisis will have a big impact on their likelihood of purchasing them in the future. And so again, I think this is really a chance for businesses to be leaning into their customers, to helping those customers work through these sort of incredible periods of uncertainty with which they find themselves. And so with that, we'll dive into sort of the first of four trends that we're going to explore, which is the overall sort of impact on business. Obviously sidelined by the coronavirus, business owners and newly unemployed Americans are struggling to find a way forward. You're finding a lot of individuals who never thought they would need unemployment are having to seek unemployment benefits because of layoffs and things of that nature, or furloughs. And as a result, they're actually finding overwhelmed system that may not meet their needs in time. And we know that business owners are trying to find solutions to certainly help employees, to help their employees and customers out. But due to just the overall impact and the scale of this, the system itself is kind of being sort of overtaxed. We've seen a lot of trade shows and conferences being, once postponed and now many of them canceled. And I think that the longer that they sort of are postponed, the more that these industries are going to realize that they can actually get by without them. We see B2B companies in particular obviously rely on the annual circuit of trade shows and exhibitions in order to network and build customer relations. And I think in industries that are not necessarily digital native, they may also be a little less sophisticated in their digital growth and customer relation strategies. And so as these conferences and trade shows shut down, companies are having to find new ways in order to sort of foster the sort of the networking and the benefits that come from those kinds of events. We know brands and companies like Microsoft, as an example, have actually pulled out of all trade shows and will only host or participate in virtual conferences through July of next year, 2021. And they've already came out and said that they'd be pulling out of CES as well. We are starting to see some experimentation happening. Amazon Prime worked with South by Southwest to create a way to actually stream the festival online. And I think this will ultimately become a more long-term solution for a lot of these trade shows and festivals. In addition to that, I think what's interesting is that we're starting to see brands develop virtual summits themselves, where in the absence of being able to do face-to-face business and grow and nurture various relationships, we're seeing brands experimenting with these virtual trade shows for prospecting, client, creating leads. And what's very good about these is the fact that every behavior and sort of action that attendees take, the sponsors and the brands that are putting these kinds of virtual conferences on are actually able to collect a lot more information about the conference attendees, so they can start to see what content was relevant, who they were networking with, and as a result of that, they can now create solutions that are going to be more apt to satisfy those customer needs. Video conferencing has quickly become a replacement for a lot of in-person sales calls and definitely staying connected with customers. And I think now it's more important than ever that sales teams are listening intently to existing customers as well as their prospects, making sure that they are scheduling daily team, check-ins to be able to share customer feedback and concerns that they're hearing from their sales prospects, as well as enabling the sales teams themselves to better understand the trends that they're starting to see with their customers. This is just a sort of a quick snapshot in terms of the overall sort of penetration of some of the top video conferencing platforms that are out there. I think what's interesting is that you certainly see some that are really catering a lot more towards the business relationship and customer management side of things, like a Zoom or a Skype and obviously Teams. And then you see things like House Party as another example, which tends to be a little bit more of a sort of social kind of personal connection. So we're definitely seeing a sort of a wide swath of conferencing systems being leveraged by both businesses as well as individuals. But I think what's interesting is what we're starting to see is what we're calling Zoom fatigue. And I think it's really driven by how many interactions seem to have automatically sort of moved to video chat, even if they were sort of meetings or conversations that, may not have been as necessary to begin with. And I think what we're starting to see is businesses and the way that they're communicating with their customers. This is the sort of the first form of outreach versus, emails and things like that. And I think that's all sort of helping drive this sort of Zoom fatigue. I will pause there. if there are any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A chat on the right-hand side as we as I go throughout the presentation.
No questions yet. Good to go.
Great. So the next trend we're going to move into is the age of anxiety. And for any of you that have obviously heard of our 2020 Innovation Outlook, it's definitely a place that we spent some time studying and talking about. And I think the role for businesses right now, as I alluded to in the beginning, is to really think about how they can help customers navigate through uncertainty, this period of uncertainty, with a lot more confidence. We know some customers will have trouble operating in a work from home sort of situation or environment. And so it's important to consider what your business can do in order to help facilitate continuity in the relationship with your customers, whether that's policy and contract extensions, holding renewal negotiations for a later date, things like that. In addition, focusing and investing in your customer and their success will also, as I said before, drive greater advocacy long-term, help deepen the loyalty and sort of the overall lifetime value that that customer would ultimately represent for your business. And yes, it shouldn't necessarily take a pandemic to sort of help businesses sort of make this a focus. But I think nonetheless, organizations are investing extra in an effort to kind of help calm and assure and keep their customers that they already have. We're seeing a lot of businesses also changing their customer policies. They're rethinking, their corporate policies to make them more relevant for the needs and what we're seeing today, whether that is suspending refund exchange windows, putting in specific shopping hours for senior citizens or first responders, or people that may have physical disabilities that might just sort of need wider space to be able to maneuver. I think all of these are things that businesses are starting to do in order to kind of address, as I said, kind of the needs of customers today. We're also seeing depressed demand for shared workspace, and I think that's only going to continue to increase, and will be really interesting to see what that looks like on the other side of this pandemic. With a looming recession could certainly prompt many freelancers and small businesses who typically might work at places like WeWork, to save money by actually working from home. And I think, again, the longer that they're sort of building out the routine and figuring out how to make their business get by from this sort of working home environment, it will make all the more challenging for places like WeWork and these sort of shared work environments to sort of recapture the demand that they had prior to the pandemic. And on the topic of working from home policies, we're certainly seeing a lot of businesses change what those entail, right? It's no longer done at an individual level or reserved for, someone who might be going out on maternity or paternity leave or having to care for an ill family member, but now it's being offered sort of universally, obviously, to all members of a business, regardless of position or tenure. And research has certainly shown that more flexible work policies give workers more control over the when, where, and how they work without sort of hurting business performance. We also see employee benefits and insurance coverage becoming sort of more sort of central to the asks that employees will ask of their employers, even more so than pay or position. It's certainly likely that this will not be the last pandemic that we face as a society, and I think employees themselves are becoming a lot more aware now of the importance of making sure that their employers are offering proper coverage. We also see a rise in cybersecurity. Obviously the risk of cyber attacks against government targets, the spread of disinformation. All of these things certainly are on the rise during this pandemic. And so with all of the individuals and businesses working from home, where there's sort of less control over, networks and things of that nature, businesses are really having to, find ways very quickly to make sure that their employees and the information and the data that they're processing stays protected and stay safe. And we know that for both large and small businesses, which typically borrow heavily in order to run their operations, are going to find it harder to tap credit as the outbreak continues to sort of curtail economic activity. And if companies are unable to tap credit to pay their rent or make payroll or finance other activities, it could force them to slash costs, whether that's laying off workers, potentially pausing investments, obviously delaying or canceling altogether different kinds of product extensions. And in some cases, businesses will actually have to declare bankruptcy as well. I think we're likely to see a lot of local and independent businesses close and not reopen. And so while sad, I think it will also obviously bring on opportunities for new businesses as well. I'll pause there for any questions.
Still good to go.
Great. So in the next section, we're going to dive a little deeper into what's happening specifically with small businesses. We know that the National Federation of Independent Business said that 3/4 of small businesses have been hurt by the COVID pandemic, experiencing everything from supply chain disruption to slower sales, and obviously employees that are having to be absent as well. And I think what's interesting is that more than half of small businesses do not believe that they can operate beyond 3 months. And so again, as we already are nearing the end of April, we're kind of essentially been dealing with this and battling this for a month and a half now. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see sort of what happens here over the next few weeks. There's been a lot of attention around essential businesses being able to remain open. And this is an area where we're particularly keen on following closely because there's essentially a randomness that is associated with determining what businesses are actually essential. As businesses in one state may be considered essential, but in another state may be designated in some other way. And so we're likely to see sort of a patchwork of coronavirus sort of era policies, causing a lot of confusion across the country overall. And I think ultimately it's pointing to the need for sort of clear federal guidelines about what should and shouldn't remain open. And I think this notion of sort of essential isn't going to go away. I think it's definitely something that, state and local areas need to sort of, think about what does that mean for their particular, market, and figure out what the right way to sort of open that up will be. And I think businesses considered most important by governors will probably be the ones that return to work first, which means that states will probably have to add more guidelines, as well. But small business owners are certainly learning that their business interruption insurance does not cover business interruptions due to COVID-19. And so a lot are looking for sort of what we call stopgap insurance plans, and looking at how businesses can sort of raise funds through a variety of different ways. 58,000 small businesses had asked for $6 billion in loans in a 9-hour period of time, which is pretty staggering. And of the business owners who said that they have to conduct layoffs, 74% have said that a loan from the federal government would help them sort of avoid this scenario. So there's obviously a real need and an immediate need for these businesses to have some kind of financial release. And then with regards to the 350B from the CARES Act and various state-run loan programs, I think those will certainly help mitigate some of the capital issues that small businesses are facing. We are seeing other lending services like Lendio, which are starting to see a lot of increased applications come through daily. We also see companies like Quicken Loans that are seeing really big increases as well in applications for businesses that are looking to refinance in the wake of lower interest rates. Some obviously out of the necessity just to stay afloat, but others also, that are still open and operating, looking at sort of capitalizing on the opportunity to lock in lower interest rates. Zerto is a peer-to-peer lending platform that lets friends and family lend and borrow funds from one another in a more sort of official setting. Through an app, the borrower can actually set a loan amount while a friends and family lender establishes sort of the repayment terms. And then once those terms are agreed on by both parties, the loan request is then serviced by Zerto. So again, we're starting to just sort of see this rise of various sort of solutions. And another example of that is Brands by Better. And so this is a coalition that is consists of about 26 direct-to-consumer brands, which are really focused on how these companies are donating a percentage of all their gross sale and proceeds to charities helping to combat the COVID-19 pandemic over the course of the month of April. So again, I think this just goes back to that point that we mentioned in the beginning in terms of what businesses are doing to help local communities. And so we're seeing a really interesting way that direct-to-consumer brands are starting to approach this.
We do have a question. Will we see certain sectors of small business manage the downturn better than others, perhaps those that can still operate virtually?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Yeah, I think that you will find what I would say are more of the digital native businesses and the ones that are reliant and pre-pandemic on a lot of sort of digital service and less reliant on things like brick and mortar. I think are going to have sort of a much easier time, obviously, kind of sustaining and ultimately sort of rebuilding. And I think for businesses that maybe did rely very heavily on brick and mortar and may not have had as advanced or built out digital strategies, while they're certainly, learning those things now and implementing those things now, it's still going to be a pretty significant learning curve for those businesses. So I would imagine that we'll continue to see more new businesses come in that are going to be digital first, in thinking about how you build relationships, grow those relationships, offer, high touch service through digital platforms versus having to rely on, sales associates and sort of face-to-face interactions in some cases. So moving into the next trend around prioritizing digital commerce to the sort of exact point that I just brought up. I think that those businesses that have viewed digital commerce as a secondary channel now need to sort of reorient every aspect of their business towards a sort of a more digital commerce mindset. I think there exists an opportunity for them to really double down on their digital commerce, thinking about how they can augment their existing offerings and potentially create new lines of service as well. And given the rapid shift to online sales, we know that sellers who had offered limited selection of their products online are now shifting to full catalog service. And as I mentioned just previously with the brick and mortar stores, ones that sort of remain closed, excuse me, with the quarantine and will remain closed until that quarantine is lifted. It's really critical for those businesses to start to pivot towards a more sort of e-commerce centric approach. And we see certainly with businesses where physical kind of high touch sales is still the norm, especially in retail. We are seeing a lot starting to adapt to ways of digitally automating or replicating that experience. We see, many companies, even ones, as I alluded to here, Alice and Olivia, that are now offering sort of personal shopping via different kinds of video conferencing and FaceTime application to, again, kind of help customers sort of stay in touch with that sort of high sales, those high sales touches. And ultimately continue to sort of drive that brand loyalty. And as part of its response to the overall pandemic, we see companies like Uber Eats, having switched all of their deliveries to contactless by default, with orders being left at the door or as instructed by a user, which I think is pretty interesting and could ultimately change the way that future deliveries are expected to be, where you're no longer just picking the time you want your order delivered, but actually specific instructions too. And so this could lead to the expansion of personalized delivery. Additionally, we know that companies like Uber Eats have also waived all delivery fees for local restaurants. And I think that may be difficult to reinstate those kinds of fees once the pandemic has passed. So again, sort of different things to sort of keep watch on. Social distancing and travel restrictions have definitely limited, traditional high-touch sales processes as well, really towards, shifting it more towards a low or no-touch purchasing. And so we're seeing a lot of businesses, realizing that they may not need as extensive sales forces or physical real estate in the post-pandemic economy as well. And even traditional media outlets are moving a lot of their content to digital formats and online delivery. If you think about things like TV, newspaper, I think the increased use of paywalls in the absence of physical delivery of newspapers and other content is something that we're continuing to see more and more of. A lot of these media outlets have utilized, have made coverage of the pandemic free and accessible to everyone. And I think that's ultimately sort of helping serve as a really sort of an upper funnel kind of lead generation tactic while they keep the non-sort of COVID content stuck behind the paywall. And so I think that we will expect to see a spike in subscription, over the rest of this year. We know already in the, over the last 4 weeks, there's been big spikes both in the US as well as Europe, with, obviously customers and consumers all wanting to, stay as connected as they can with updated news and information. Any questions there?
Nope, good to go.
Cool. So looking at the gig economy, we see a lot of the companies within the gig economy. At one point we're doing very little to protect their workers, but obviously being asked to sort of juggle mismatched supply and demand and alleviate everyone's financial strains. There was a lot of sort of pressure being put on these gig businesses. We see things like Amazon shipping, which they just announced, I think it was last week, that they have suspended shipping on non-Amazon packages, as even it struggles to keep up with customer orders during the pandemic. And so again, this could create new opportunities for companies like FedEx and UPS and even last mile delivery services, where some of them may have sort of already fallen victim in certain markets to just sort of the massive appeal and use of Amazon, but now there's sort of opportunity for them to sort of play a little bit of catch up in those regards. We also see, companies like Starship Technologies, which are using autonomous robots in more and more cities, as the increase for contactless sort of delivery continues to rise. Right now, they're available in Arizona, California, and Washington, D.C., and we expect to see this roll out into more cities as well. Postmates and other companies like Uber and Lyft have long claimed that their workers are self-employed entrepreneurs rather than employees entitled to, a minimum wage and overtime and unemployment and other kinds of protections. And they had sort of contested any, lawsuit and legislation that was sort of seeking to reclassify their workers. But a couple of weeks ago, the New York gig workers actually won the right to unemployment benefits. And so, for example, New York Postmates food delivery drivers, can now receive unemployment benefits, which is, sort of a pretty big turning point with regards to, obviously, the benefits and things that are available now to those individuals. This is something that we have not yet seen here in the States, but I thought was really interesting. In China, delivery person's body temperature is now being displayed in mobile apps. It's not unlikely to see how something like this could ultimately come here to the States and expand to services like ride sharing or Airbnbs in terms of previous guests and what who had stayed there. But I think ultimately you're seeing a lot of these sort of gig businesses looking for ways to be able to recapture consumer trust and confidence that, whether it's, where you're staying or what you're using or how products are coming to you, that it's all being done, safely and with your sort of health and mindfulness being top of mind. This was something that we kind of found very just sort of, uplifting, frankly. But this was something coming out of Maryland where a wine company had utilized a delivery dog to offer curbside wine pickup during the lockdown. And again, I just think it's a fascinating and interesting way in terms of how businesses are having to sort of think and address sort of these the change in what consumers are looking for and how they're looking to get those products. Any questions there?
Yes, a couple. First one, what are the main barriers of enabling contactless payment at brick and mortar small businesses? Anything beyond the cost of purchasing the contactless terminals?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a big one. I think ultimately you need to ensure any kind of training for employees. I think there is, if you're going to be using an existing system, it's about making sure that, your business is, one, has patrons that actually, know how to use that particular service in addition to the employees that might work at a particular retailer. So I think there's definitely sort of a big learning curve with regards to some of that. I think it'll be interesting to see the increased use of contactless payments and things like that in the future. I expect that we'll find a lot of bridge technologies being implemented, more and more brands and companies starting to adapt the Amazon Go kind of scenario. But I think that those things are going to take time to be rolled out, especially when you start to get into larger chains. I think you're going to start to find, how quickly things can be scaled will ultimately impact cost as well.
Yep. And there was a follow-up to that. Can we ever get away from the need to sign credit card receipts?
That's a great question. Legally speaking, I don't know the answer to that. Personally speaking, I tend to just put a straight line on the screen when it asks, so I don't know.
I will jump in and say that I know that up to a certain limit, and I don't recall exactly what the limit is off the top of my head, but below a certain limit, I believe is something like $100 or maybe a little higher than that. It is up to the retailer to set when they're requiring signatures. If you're using something like Apple Pay or Google Pay, some contactless payment, they do not have to do that. That is something that retailers are opting into.
Great. Any other questions there?
That's it for now.
Great. So moving into the final trend we'll talk about today, as I mentioned sort of throughout, is really thinking about how the pandemic is helping to drive brand trust for businesses with their customers. We talked a little bit before about the emphasis on social responsibility and how customers are going to be looking at businesses in terms of what did they do to help combat COVID-19. We're starting to see, again, sort of a lot of businesses take various kinds of actions to really put customers at the center. And as I mentioned before, ultimately help them sort of move through this period of uncertainty. And I think a lot of it is about, walking the walk and companies putting purpose before profit, and how they're looking at how they can really get involved and support local communities, because right now there's such a desire, honestly, for consumers to be able to sort of find positive and kind of uplifting stories. And so the more that businesses are doing to sort of help even the local communities sort of work through the pandemic. Those kinds of stories are making their way into sort of more national channels, and are bringing ultimately greater, a lot of strong PR value for various businesses. Additionally, we have seen a lot of companies reshuffle their production lines in order to cater towards new needs. We see a lot of non-medical companies producing emergency medical equipment. And I think what's interesting about this is, having done and gone through the sort of pivot of production facilities once, I think you're going to see a lot of these businesses gain confidence, and they might be more willing to sort of pivot again in the future, potentially even for more non-emergency reasons, but certainly, for any kind of future pandemic that we might face. Some companies are certainly straying outside of their core business models and are repurposing their assets to assist the greater human cause. We've seen a lot from brands like LVMH to AB InBev, and a number of others making things from hand sanitizer to ventilators to masks and gowns. A lot of the shipping companies obviously prioritizing, any kind of medical supplies as well. Lyft is also expanding the types of services it provides through on-demand transportation network, in an effort, again, to kind of help boost efforts with fighting the pandemic. They're offering delivery of critical medical supplies to individuals who obviously need them most, looking at people specifically like the elderly or people that are dealing with any kind of chronic diseases or diseases and conditions that might require sort of daily or weekly treatments. It's in addition to that, it's even delivering meals to students who may normally get subsidized lunches through school, as well as senior citizens. One of the other things that they've been expanding to recently is transporting individuals for medical services and healthcare appointments and treatments. So again, they're really finding ways to be able to maximize their value. And again, ultimately will lead to more sustained loyalty on the other side of the pandemic. And then lastly, even companies like here, where we see sort of the Four Seasons in New York, which are offering crisis-related accommodations for customers and any kind of first responders. We've definitely seen a lot of businesses getting involved in extending themselves to show their support for the people that are obviously kind of on the front lines dealing with the pandemic day in and day out. And so as we think about the other side of the pandemic and what the next normal looks like for business-to-business marketing, there's sort of 6 things that I think it's important for us to keep in mind. I think one is really, making sure that from a brand standpoint, businesses are really keeping all of their information up to date as possible. Looking at their business profiles, making sure that they have correct store hours, changes to return policies or store closures, special shopping hours, as we mentioned before, for different kinds of consumer demographics and segments. All of those things are really important in making sure that consumers are able to find the best answer possible as quickly as they need it. We've definitely seen a rise and an increase in the use of virtual events and video conferencing, things like podcasts and live streaming and recorded video, and just finding ways to continue to engage with customers. Direct mail is definitely another opportunity where, knowing that customers are all sort of quarantined to their homes, they become sort of an easier target to be able to reach through those kinds of channels as well. And especially so when you think about even trade magazines and other forms of B2B marketing through traditional channels like direct mail, where what was once maybe sent to the office, where obviously employees are no longer able to receive it. It's important to make sure that you're bringing that information online as well and being able to reach customers. The second thing is just looking around the overall sort of new class of influencers. We see a lot of individuals that are really leaning in towards their own sort of passions and areas of expertise, or using this time to really hone different kinds of skills, and how those, excuse me, that's leading to new businesses that are launching, and finding ways to sort of monetize different kinds of skills in that regard. Thirdly, I think the increased use of dynamic messaging and content is only going to continue to increase. Leveraging virtual events and digital activity with customers will definitely allow for businesses to better personalize the place and the moment that they're re-messaging their customers. And I think even for B2C brands as well, we're at a place where you can no longer afford to kind of leave a consumer guessing if a product is available and what sizes and colors. And so businesses should really be looking to prioritize getting that information in front of the consumers as quickly and as accurately as possible. And with that, I think it's important to think about how commerce strategies ultimately get optimized towards a more sort of digital sort of first mentality. Reevaluating how relationships are sort of grown, how the funnel is different tactics need to be used now in order to capture leads at sort of the upper funnel, but then sort of bring them through all the way to conversion. And I think the more that you can kind of take those insights and the behavioral sort of data signals that customers are putting out online and being able to better articulate messaging, and that's ultimately going to drive for a more optimized sort of commerce experience for them. As we just mentioned, in terms of pivoting production lines, I think a lot of brands didn't know what they were capable of, and they found ways to really lean into sort of this moment of crisis when consumers needed assistance. And I think they found even some evergreen use cases potentially for facilities that may be underutilized at different times during the year. So this could lead to sort of increased revenue in the future. And then finally, just thinking about how brands can look at expanding shipping and delivery offerings. Historically, Amazon has owned the perception of sort of the ultimate brand that caters and can kind of handle all form of delivery and shipping. But I think in this pandemic, we've started to see sort of a more equal playing field come out, where you have a lot of businesses being able to offer similar and unique delivery options that are highly personalized. And so I think there's, again, kind of an opportunity sort of moving forward for businesses to continue to kind of lean into those ways where they can continue to harness and optimize the way that they service their customers. So I will pause here for any additional questions on the last section or the next normal or anything else that may have popped up in your head.
Looks like we might be good.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you everybody for listening in. We appreciate it. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. Be more than happy to discuss and dive into any specific areas as it relates to your specific business and what the implications of some of the trends and things that we've been observing mean for them. So thank you again for your time, and we'll talk to you guys soon.